Friday, the 10th of September, signifies World Suicide Prevention Day, an opportunity to raise awareness, reduce stigma, and encourage conversations about suicide. For decades, Australia has had some of the highest rates of child suicide in Indigenous communities in the world.
It is estimated every 45 seconds someone takes their life, and that every year suicide profoundly affects over 108 million people.
We welcome world leader in Aboriginal health, psychologist, adjunct professor, and Western Australian's 2018 Australian of the Year, Dr Tracy Westerman, a Nyamal woman from the Pilbara region of Western Australia. Welcome, Doctor.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for discussing this complex topic with us today. You originally founded the Indigenous Psychological Services, which is a research and cultural specialist in mental health services for Aboriginal people. And during your PhD, you also developed the first Aboriginal symptoms checklist for youth, which is for kids at risk of suicide. And with all the incredible research and training workshops and support that you offer, what are your main goals at IPS?
Yeah, there's so many. I'm fortunate that I'm a natural goal setter, and sometimes that can be a bad thing, because if you set your goals too high and you fail to attain them, that can be a little bit, disheartening. But fortunately, I've lived one of those lives that the goals that we've attained have been incredible. And the first starting point to that has been that we've been able to actually achieve a lot of evidence-based practice where there historically has not been evidence-based practice for our most highest risk Indigenous communities. And I guess in terms of what I want to achieve, well, I want to actually come on shows like this and not talk about the fact that we have the highest rates of child suicide in the world in our Indigenous communities anymore. And, we cover off pretty much all the statistics at a global level. We have the highest rates of incarceration of Indigenous people in the world in our own backyard. We can also mount an argument for the fact that we probably have the highest rates of child removal in our Indigenous communities. We have 56% of kids in care in Western Australia who are Indigenous. And of course, our education outcomes are at a level that we're seeing something like only 40% of Indigenous kids currently complete Year 12. I guess the most important thing for me is that I get really frustrated by the fact that leadership fails to understand their responsibility well in this country. I'd like to see national leadership and state leadership talk to our most disadvantaged, actually, and our most marginalised. And I think that there has been a real failure of, whether it's from the Prime Minister to state premiers, talking about Indigenous people in a way that's a celebration of our Indigenous culture. And the fact that that's where the heavy lifting needs to occur the most, that's the greatest responsibility of leadership that we just haven't really seen.
A recent article, you talk about incorporating elements of culture in psychology. So can you expand on that a bit more? And what do you mean by culture-bound syndromes?
This is a really great question. I guess mental health can actually look very different from different cultural perspectives. So what we always say as psychologists is that if you get assessment wrong, you get treatment wrong, and you can make things worse. So everything really starts with getting assessment right. Quite often there are a lot of things that we consider to be quite normal within the Aboriginal culture. So for example, it's very common that people have spiritual visits of people that have passed away. And that's actually a very common cultural phenomenon. When someone's passed away, they'll visit us spiritually. Now, sadly, when people come into contact with mainstream services, that looks like someone who's schizophrenic or psychotic. And so what we're finding, there's lots of different culture-bound syndromes that certainly I've validated in my research, but that's one example. And what we're seeing in terms of the statistics is that Aboriginal people have 17 times the rate of psychosis and schizophrenia compared to non-Aboriginal populations. And so the prevalence data we're seeing is, frankly, it's not possible to have rates of schizophrenia and psychosis that are that high. So what's happening is, because people are trained in a mainstream way, they don't know what they don't know. So it's not intentional that people are trying to misdiagnose or overdiagnose. It's just that they're coming in from a very different world perspective. So culture-bound syndromes, I've actually published the first paper on validation of culture-bound syndromes in Aboriginal Australian populations, which is really exciting, because now what can happen is that universities can train psychiatrists and train psychologists and so forth to get assessment right, and then get treatment right, and then make things better.
You've also founded the Westerman Jilya Institute for Indigenous Mental Health. What is the purpose of this institute, and why are federal or state governments not doing more to fund suicide prevention?
Yeah, I guess the idea behind the Western Jilya Institute, interestingly enough, it was born out of frustration. And I'm a natural optimist, so it was really hard for me to admit that. And look, it was quite distressing how the Jilya Institute started. Was basically we had the Fogliani inquiry into 13 suicide deaths of Indigenous youth in the Kimberley. And that was the fourth coronial inquiry that had occurred of Indigenous suicides in the Kimberley since 2009. And the suicides were still continuing to escalate. The reason why these children were dying was because of this thing that they referred to as system failure. Now, what that meant was that children didn't have access to services. So the more remote you are, the harder services are to access. You throw culture into the mix. And then, of course, what happens is it becomes really difficult to get access to services. So children should not be dying from want in a world of excess. And so that day I picked up the phone and I donated $50,000 of my own money to start the Dr Tracy Westerman Indigenous Psychology Scholarship Program, predominantly to increase the number of Indigenous psychologists in remote areas. Like I said, the Jilya Institute was started out of frustration, but essentially what now has happened is that it's grown really quickly, and we now have 15 Indigenous psychologists under the Western Jilya Institute for Indigenous Mental Health that we've found funding to support in just 9 months. And so that's going to make a significant difference in relation to getting best practice services into those communities that are our highest risk communities. In terms of what government aren't doing, how long have you got? I guess, how long is this program? I guess the first thing is just that they haven't done that. They haven't provided access to those really, really remote communities. And I guess it starts with my first point, that leadership really doesn't speak to our most marginalised. Leadership should be speaking to our highest risk, most vulnerable, marginalised communities. Because if we actually address our most vulnerable communities, then equality becomes something that becomes fairly much easier, because access has actually been improved at the most difficult level. So that's the problem, I guess, is the services just haven't been provided in those regions. The next thing we aren't doing really well is we're just not, strangely enough, we don't actually have programs that actually measure outcome, quite simply. So funded programs are actually not required to demonstrate that they're measuring suicide risk reduction in, for example, criminality risk factors. So the thing that's really shocking to me is that if you just measured outcome nationally, if you create a national database of outcome across suicide prevention, across mental health prevention, you would clean up a lot of these issues nationally. And so that's what the Jilya Institute is going to spend our time doing, is driving data nationally to ensure that programs are actually focused on the right things, right risk factors, and that we're actually demonstrating a measurable reduction in suicide and mental health risk factors at a national level. So that's really what our communities deserve. They deserve to be really clear that our programs are having a measurable impact.
100%. And I wish you the best of luck with the Institute. It sounds like a fantastic initiative. And further to that, recently there has been a lot of news about the redress scheme for the stolen generation survivors. So what are some systemic or cultural changes that need to happen to further empower First Nations communities?
I think, again, providing the leadership, it's that thing where when you're vulnerable and you're remote, often what's happening is you're left to each other to help each other. And often what happens is families have to be left in the role of service providers. I mean, this is a really, really damning statistic, I guess, is that we have 218 Indigenous psychologists in this country out of 30,000 registered psychologists. So I'll just let that statistic kind of hit you a little bit. What that means is if we look at the prevalence rates, the non-prevalence rates of mental health, that means that for every 1,000 Indigenous people who are in mental health distress, there is one psychologist, Indigenous psychologist available to help. So there is a massive responsibility here on behalf of all services and all organisations to improve workforce capacity to be able to meet those needs of Indigenous people that we're currently not meeting. And if we do that, and we do that well, then of course the statistics across most of these areas in Australia are going to dive fairly dramatically because of the overrepresentation of Indigenous people across all of those statistics that we've already talked about. So I just wish that they would do that, because people can put their hands up when they're in distress, but what our data tells us is that only 6% of Aboriginal people in distress will go to a mental health service. And that's a damning indictment on a lack of cultural and clinical competence in those programs that are available.
Absolutely. Now, the Institute recently tweeted about an exciting upcoming fundraising event. Can you please tell us more?
Yeah, the Western and Jilya Institute for Indigenous Mental Health, we don't, even though we've got 15 Indigenous psychologists under my scholarship program, we actually don't have funding, like guaranteed funding, other than some wonderful philanthropists and some government organisations that fund a lot of our recipients long term, and of course my own personal donation. So the idea behind the concert is to raise funds to increase the number of Indigenous psychologists that are under my scholarship, and it's going to be run on World Suicide Prevention Day. Now, the reason why it's on World Suicide Prevention Day is because, shockingly, despite the fact that we have the highest rates of child suicide in the world in our own backyard and our Indigenous communities, Indigenous suicides were not mentioned on World Suicide Prevention Day. And so that was so distressing to me, working with so many bereaved parents. And so I set off on a path to change that. The first step to healing is that your pain is validated. And the worst pain is to feel as if you are invisible. And so when the pain of our Indigenous people is invisible to most Australians, it becomes really difficult for people to feel as if to heal. And so there's a couple of things going on in the background around just these lives matter. Let's brand it with World Suicide Prevention Day so it's amplified, and that people actually feel as if this actually that the lives of their children matter equally. And so I think the great thing about the concert is, even though it's about Indigenous suicide, it's such a night of optimism and hope. And if we can lift the pain of a bereaved Indigenous parent just for one night, and also show them that, look at all of these Indigenous psychologists at a practical level that are putting their hands up to say that we want to do the heavy lifting so that we don't continue to have the highest rates of Indigenous child suicide in the world. And it is a real optimistic night. And it's Indigenous artists that have all donated their time. So Gina Williams, who is an incredible, frankly, I just think that she's a national treasure. She's amazing. Her and Guy Gauss, who jumped on straight away to donate their time. Bo Jesse Pigram, who came 12th on The Voice. He's just amazing. Naomi Pigram, who's his auntie. And the Pigram family are actually a very, very big family, musical family in the Kimberley. So it's great to have that Kimberley representation, because they've carried the burden of suicides for a long time now, in this country for a couple of decades now. So it's great to have their participation. Kobe Morrison, who is a Noongar boy who's 2018 NAIDOC Scholar of the Year. And of course, our special guest is John Butler, who signed on about 2 months ago, within less than 24 hours of me sending a letter, an aspirational letter, let's face it, to his manager. I was expecting a Dr Tracy letter back. And within less than 24 hours, they said we'd be honoured to play. So everyone's playing pro bono or free. Tina Altieri is also well known as a newsreader, Channel 7 newsreader. She is emceeing the event. And we've also got Ash Penfold, who runs a beautiful organisation called Corroboree for Life, who has these beautiful young Indigenous kids, and himself doing just a welcome to country type corroboree at the very start. So it's an incredible evening that we hope will be a massive success.
Yeah, it sounds incredibly awesome. So how can people gain access or buy tickets? Hopefully it's not sold out yet.
Well, no, I think we're trying to get 200 seats sold in the next 3 weeks. So we've still got 200 seats left, and they're actually at pretty reasonable prices. There's still a handful at $90, so that is really cheap. It's at the beautiful Winthrop Hall at UWA, University of Western Australia in Perth. We've also done the Winthrop Hall for free. We've got quite a few tickets at $110 as well, and they are all available at Tickets WA. So you can literally just Google Tickets WA and the Jilya, and Jilya is spelled Jilya. The other thing that people can do, because everyone's in lockdown sadly, and people keep saying, well, how can I contribute? There are so many ways you can contribute. the first thing, which is just so lovely, we've had a very significant push, I guess, to underwrite the cost of a seat for a bereaved Indigenous family member to attend the concert for free. And so we blocked 100 seats for that purpose. Now, I've been really overwhelmed. It's been amazing. We've had 50 seats underwritten just by donations to the Jilya Institute. And so we've been overwhelmed with bereaved Indigenous families, which is kind of, it's a hard thing, isn't it, when you're overwhelmed by the number of bereaved families, because it breaks your heart that there's so many. But it's also lovely that they feel as if there's something positive that they can actually come to for a change to be part of. So we've got 50 seats that are already full within 2 days of announcing, that the seats are available. So people can still donate to underwrite the cost of a seat from $110 and do that. And the other thing, they can just donate to the Jilya Institute directly. We are a registered charity, and so every dollar is tax deductible. So that's my plug.
Doctor, thank you so much. It has been an honour to meet and discuss this with you, and thank you for all your work, insights and recommendations.
You're very welcome. And thank you so much, ladies. It's been, and hopefully we'll get more tickets sold, and this will be, what I'm hoping is the event will become bigger and bigger and bigger each year. This is people power. People power is going to get this done. Black and white Australians coming together, and it's just a wonderful, wonderful night.
Oh, thank you, Tracy. And for those watching at home, please, on 8 p.m. of September 10th, don't forget to safely light a candle near a window to show your support for suicide prevention.
And if you or anyone you know needs help, some support services are available here.
And for crisis support or suicide intervention services, call 13 11 14.